well, they had to find ways to live, and that was possible. You know, there was food and there was work. Dad became a worker in wood, like a carpenter. You know, he was very good with his hands. He was very talented. He said they would go, you know, get employment to go somewhere and do some building somewhere. And Mum, she learnt some dressmaking, and she became very good at making clothes. And she could also design her own patterns, and she used to make our clothes. She made all her own clothes, and they were unique, and they looked Russian, you know, particularly the dresses that she would make. Well, Mum actually, when she was about 16, she had Galina. Galina's father is not our father. She hadn't met our father then. His name was Laptiev. I can't remember his first name at the moment. But anyway, he was older than Mum and took advantage of her. She was young. She probably wasn't even 16, and she got pregnant. And he was supposed to be her teacher. And so she'd gone to school. She was taken advantage of by her older teacher. So unfortunately, he did not help my mother when she became pregnant with Galina. So Galina was born, and Mum's mother, our grandmother, she helped her to look after Galina. And Galina told me that she loved her grandmother. And when Galina was, 7 or 8, Mum had met Dad. And then, of course, Nadia was born within, I don't know how long, maybe a year or two. And then there came Anna, then Joseph, who passed away when he was 6 years old, so I don't remember him. Then Benjamin, then me, Ruth. Then Peter was born in Australia, and Wally was born in Australia. So what happened when they were in China, the Chinese had their revolution, and in time it moved westward and came to the outlying regions in Xinjiang, which our parents grew up in Xinjiang, which is just on the other side of the southwest and Siberia. So they'd grown up, and got married, and were bringing up their family there. But when the Chinese Revolution eventually came there, it became difficult for them. Dad says that it was not easy there. It became controlled. People would be forced to meet in groups, and they would go through these, being politicised. And so people would have to basically accept communism. So people were trying to find dissidents, and so there was a lot of conflict going on. It was difficult, and the Chinese had also made it clear to the people who were not of Chinese origin, or ethnic Chinese, that they weren't really citizens. They just lived there. They were residents or whatever. They lived there, and they were told they just had to do the right thing, but they weren't a part of the communist revolution, basically. So, but they still had to go along with it. Now, there were quite a few Russians in various places in China, so there was some agreement between the Chinese and the Russian government. And so they were allowed to live there, and but the Russians said, well, you know, anyone that wants to leave, you just send them back here to Russia. So, but a lot of them didn't want to go back. And there were some people in another area where there were a lot of rich people that had actually lived in Harbin in China. Now that was a Tsarist settlement, which had to do with the railroad and trading. And they had been there for a long time. That wasn't like where our people had moved in response to starvation and just wanting to survive. These were settlers that had been settled there as part of the Tsarist rule. But anyway, they were thinking of leaving. A lot of them found ways to actually emigrate away. And our parents, they didn't want to go back to Russia, and it wasn't good for them in China, so they decided to leave. And they decided they would try and emigrate to another country. So they, now to do that, they had to organise some money to travel and to live, in the city when they were going through their immigration, because they had to travel east to Shanghai. Dad was really good with making things, so they would make beehives and sell them. And that was one of the ways that they raised enough money to travel. They raised bees, like they made the hives, populated the hives and then sold them as working beehives. So anyway, the last born there was Benjamin, and Mum was already pregnant with me when they travelled over to Shanghai, and I was born in Shanghai, and it took them a couple of years to finally get, they had to find a country who would take them. They had to be recognised as refugees, but it was on the basis of religion, not on politics, because our parents didn't want to go back and live in a country where they couldn't practice their religion or worship God in the way that they chose to. So they, when they were in Shanghai, they were actually sponsored by a Christian man in Australia. He was a Seventh-day Adventist. Before they were accepted in Australia, there were other possibilities, but the only other possibility that I know of was that Mum was hoping to go to Israel. Now, I don't know, Dad basically just didn't want to go back to the USSR, and he wanted his family to survive and live in a good country. So, but Mum had an idea that Israel was a place that she wanted to go. But she couldn't go. She tried, but they wouldn't. The Chinese government wouldn't let any Russians go to Israel. There was a policy that the Russian government said, okay, well, if they go to another country, they're not to go to an enemy country. So at that time, Israel was considered an enemy country by USSR, and so they were found by someone in Australia. So that was how Australia came about, because they hadn't picked Australia particularly. And they were one of the first Russians that came from that area, that came to Australia. After that, quite a few people that Mum and Dad knew, families that moved over, came to Australia, followed. And, Anna's family, who she married into, the Tarasenkos and Kondratenkos, Naja's family, they all came out and settled in Sydney. Anyway, so they came to Australia in 1956, and that was the year Peter was born. So Mum I think she was already pregnant on her travels. And Joseph died in the first 6 months after in the first year, I think, he passed away. So it was a very hard time for Mum. He died from diphtheria. Ben also had diphtheria, and he almost died. And so he got very, very sick, and Ben got sick, and he was getting very sick. And Mum finally said that she just went to the post office and said to the woman, because they lived in a semi-rural area in Sydney, they'd moved to Bonnyrigg. Well, first of all, when they came to Australia, they lived in somewhere in the city of Sydney, in the house of our sponsor. But that was only for a few months, and then they found a small block of land which they either got a loan or purchased, and Dad was working in a factory, and he'd built a little tin shed, and that had an earth floor.